Hello and welcome. Please put your hands together for your MC for the day, TM Rastigar.
Oh, there's a silicone wafer. I almost stepped on it. Where's Perry? All right, guys, we made it almost to the end. I'm here to announce our closing keynote. But before I ask him to come on stage, I'm supposed to tell you that immediately following the closing keynote that you all should go to the exhibitor hall because all of you registered to win those prizes, right? Right? In order to do that, you had to download the app, and I'm sure all of you did that as well. So I'm going to stop harping on you. But we give away the prizes between 4:30 and 5 right there in the exhibit hall. And the way I'd like to introduce our closing keynote, I'll just tell you, his title, he's the Director of Architecture at Microsoft, which got my attention right away yesterday. But, he's worked as a chief technologist, architect, author, inventor, entrepreneur for the past 30 years. And as Perry was going through his dry run yesterday, as we were on stage just practicing, doing the motions and the handoffs and back and forth, he's dialing in his audio on some of the videos. I can tell you this much, I had to go home and Google a few things that he presented and he told me about because I'm not a technologist and it was like this. It was way above my head. But I didn't want to show up today pretending to Perry like I didn't know what he was talking about, so I did my homework and I think I'm prepped. It says that he has over 70 patents in areas of computing, imaging, and communications. In short, he's just a brilliant technologist, and I'm not just saying that because he's standing over there in the corner. I got a glimpse at the slide deck, and again, if you have to go Google stuff off of someone's deck, they're teaching you a thing or two. But without further ado, here's our closing keynote for the IMTECH event. Perry Lee, join us on stage. I'll take mine in blue, Perry, by the way.
Well, I might disappoint you. All right. Let's see. Mic working okay? Good. All right. So this is going to be exciting. It's going to be a little different than maybe some of the other keynotes and talks you've had here. A lot of things were inspirational. I'm going to bring it down a notch. I might disappoint you, but I'm going to try to leave you on an upbeat message. So the talk here is, where is my flying car? And so what am I, 50, 54, 55? I don't know how old I am, but somewhere in there. I grew up in the 70s, and I'm a product of the vision of the future. I watched Space 1999. In 2001, Stanley Kubrick's book that I read 7 times before I was 8 years old, I was blown away. We're supposed to be having space stations. We're supposed to be having HAL with general intelligence. We're supposed to be having flying cars. So we're going to talk about that. But in every lecture I do, and I'm an industrialist and I'm an academic, I've founded companies, whatever. If you only take 2 things away here, I'm going to give you the best advice that I ever received, which is the 20% rule. We'll talk about that later. I went through a doctoral program in electrical engineering. That's the best advice I ever got. And the second thing is cautionary tales of hype and experts. So you could say, well, are you an expert? Well, you should take everything that I'm saying with a little grain of salt. So let's move on. So where do we start? Well, this is how I grew up. And here's my flying car. So I come home from school at 3:30 from parochial school in Wisconsin. This is on, channel 18. There's my flying car. Look at this. And when you drop your kids off, this little bubble, and you shoot your kid off to school. Do the same thing with your daughter, goes to high school. High schools are built on these platforms. I don't know why they're 600 feet in the air, but they are. Anyways, we know how this ends. No one came to work in your flying car. But here's the reality. So how many of you watched 60 Minutes last week? Anyone? No, like 2 people. Okay, cool. So I did. And here is your actual flying car. And for whatever reason, it's called the Jetson. You could actually buy this now. So there's some constraints. It's single passenger. It weighs 210 pounds. The battery lasts 20 minutes. You can't fly it anywhere where there's population. And it costs $96,000. And there's 2 makers of these, and there's probably be more. They're glorified drones, quadricopters, and they look like a lot of fun. But they're completely impractical, and we don't have them. I don't have one. I don't want one. And so the whole message here is, well, why have we been trying to fly and commute for 60 years? So, and the really interesting thing is the biggest change with commuting and with, with everything that's happened in the last 2 years is I don't commute anymore. I run an entire team at Microsoft specializing in, well, Xbox, video game systems worldwide, and none of us commute, and it can be done. That actually solved a problem. This causes problems. Because what do you do after 20 minutes? Well, you better have a crew of about 4 people that can lift that thing in the middle of a desert, put it back in your pickup truck, drive it home, charge it, and then you can have 20 more minutes of flying time if you didn't buy the extra battery pack. So this isn't happening. The bigger question is, what is really happening? So I'm going to divide up this talk into 2 parts, the reality and the hype. So let's talk about the reality. I need a car. I sold my car last June that I had for 20 years. I loved it too. It was a VW Jetta. I don't buy cars. I don't need a car. But I wanted to sell it because it was the time to sell your used vehicle last June. And I got a premium for it. Well, now I would actually like a car. So I went car shopping. Well, here are the expected times I've been told for a few cars that I've looked at. And you look at a 2022 Audi e-tron. I want an electric car. And a 2022 model, if you put money down now, you can get it in 23. That really is, by definition, a late model vehicle. A 2022 RAV4, 11-month lead time. A Ford Mustang Mach-E. I looked at that too. We test drove it. It was a really nice car. 24-week delay. And 60,000 vehicles are waiting on a single chip. Single chip. Okay, well, tell me more. Well, this is interesting. This is the Michigan State University. And this is their parking lot. Well, that's not a parking lot of students and academics. That's Chevy Silverados all waiting on a single chip. And they've leased out the parking lot. Well, it gets worse than that. This is the Kentucky State Speedway. The Kentucky State Speedway from space, before and after, this is their parking lot. And the Kentucky State Speedway houses 100,000 spectators. They have approximately 50,000 vehicles sitting here waiting for a single chip. These pesky little chips. So where are these things used? Well, about 20 years ago, there were only about 50 chips, semiconductor components in a vehicle. Today, there's over 3,000, and they do everything. Everything that you can imagine has some smarts, has a power controller to it, has a big processor, has memory, has all this stuff waiting on these chips. You can't buy a car without having chips and a lot of software in it. Well, we all know that. Well, this is a little more dose of reality. This is the current lead times for different chips. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what do all these chips mean. Some of you know, some of you don't know, some of you don't care, but you need all these components in a vehicle. Power management chips. If you have anything that's electronic, it has to have a little circuit in there that controls the power of your device. You have microcontrollers. This little pointer thing has a little microcontroller in it. If I attempt to buy this controller from a company called Renesas right now, I'm going to be waiting 52 weeks to get that part. It used to be 4 to 8 weeks, now it's 52. The CPU that controls your auto navigation, your driverless, your infotainment, even your dashboard, 12 to 16 weeks, not as bad. Memory, Wi-Fi, radios, the LCD screen in your device. Actually, LCD screens aren't doing too bad right now. But substrate materials, we'll talk about that here. The underlying, this is, I don't know if you've ever seen something like this. If you ever worked at Micron, you see these all over the place. If you ever worked in semiconductors, this is a true 300 millimeter wafer with a bunch of dies. The substrate is basically what's under this, the base layer of your silicon. That's 52 weeks. You need those substrate materials to build memory chips, CPUs, and whatnot. It's all one big logistics nightmare. And then you have to rely on chip packaging. So this is not going in your car. These are just raw chips that aren't cut. You got to cut them, and then you got to package them. A 12-week delay. This is why there's this gluttony of supply. Let's dig into that a little more. And this is fun. Where does a chip start? It actually starts with sand. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but this is how a semiconductor starts. This is a boule. That big, weird tubular structure is grown in a superheated vat of silicon. And there's a catalyst that you dip into the silicon and you gently pull out. And you'll see that here. It's unbelievably hot. And it creates this crystalline structure that forms, well, essentially a semiconductor substrate. And then it goes into a machine like this, and then it's sliced and diced in these little thin wafers. Now, that starts with sand. We all know that silicon is part sand. We're running out of sand. You may have heard that, and you're like, what do you mean? There's sand all over. You can go to the Bruno Dunes. There's piles of sand. You can go to a sandbox. There's sand. There's sand at Home Depot. Well, it's not the right sand. And the other problem is that sand is also used in a lot of other operations, like in concrete construction and whatnot. So we actually have a supply chain issue with sand, the fundamental component where you start silicon. But it gets worse. If you look at this, this is I'm not going to go through all these steps, but this is what it takes to build a chip. And what's really interesting here is you kind of start on the upper left, and it goes in this loop. And it goes in this loop a bunch of times as you're building a three-dimensional structure, slowly and slowly. As a matter of fact, there's 1,000 steps, they're called recipes, that are used by fabs to create a chip. And it goes through this process, and those recipes are held to their heart. That's where the IP is. It takes 3 months to build a chip, no matter what it is. Some of them are maybe 1 month, 2 months, but it certainly is not the production time of a Ford vehicle of 2 hours. And that's because there is no structure on Earth with more detail, more engineering, and more fidelity than semiconductor manufacturing. It is the grand challenge problem, and there has been no industry that has successfully built more transistors, more functionality, and provided more value than semiconductor. This is why there's Moore's Law. That's why we're all here. This is IT, and IT is based on the foundation of this hardware. And because of these supply issues, this is why I'm not getting a car for 12 months. So what are these fabs? Well, there's really only 4 fabs left in the world that can actually build silicon and be cost effective. To be cost effective, you need to produce 100,000 wafers per month. And to build a new fab, and Intel's building a fab in Ohio for about $17 billion. Samsung's building a fab, I believe in Texas, for $20 billion. That is the cost to build a competitive fab right now. It is an immense capital expenditure, and it will presumably only last for about 4 to 5 years. Imagine sinking that capital and trying to reclaim that in 4 to 5 years before the node changes. And right now, you heard of like nanometers. We're going to be dealing with angstroms. Some of the stuff I look at right now are below nanometers. This is where you start dealing with quantum effects of silicon. So this is all interesting. But the other problem here is that could be up to 10,000 suppliers that feed this machine. If you go to Micron, for example, they have all these machines, and they have that many suppliers. And what's interesting is now we get into geopolitical aspects. So the most interesting part of a fabrication process is that over there, extreme UV photolithography. There's only one company on the planet right now that can build a photolithography machine that can build chips competitively at those levels. 20 angstroms, now we're talking about atomic nucleus levels. That's ASML, and they're in the Netherlands. And they build machines like you see on that extreme UV photolithography. And it eats a consumable. And that consumable that's used in that photolithography for these excimer lasers is neon. The world's supply of neon comes out of Ukraine. There's a supply issue there now. Well, that's a little discerning. What can we do? Well, before I tell you what we do, I'm going to give you that 20% rule. So, after you get a doctorate in engineering, they go through a lot of crap, right? And one of the most relevant things that I had was a professor. He was not really an academic, he was more of an industrialist. And in this class, we had this book called The Goal. And it was basically the theory of constraints. A lot of you probably have read it. And it talks about Pugi. I'm not going to go into it, but basically you have a system. You keep refining it and refining it and refining the system and improving it. You correct mistakes. You find the weak links in that factory of all those processes, or in your organization with all its processes, or in your personal life and how you do all your processes, and you refine it. And you keep refining it until the system is maximized. Well, the unwritten message that my professor told me was that's bullshit. You better give yourself some budget. And the numbers behind that 20%, there's no litmus test or budget or information or any kind of data-driven measure that says you need 20% because of all these academic exercises I did. It's because plan for a rainy day. And I can't tell you how many times that has saved my butt, saved my organization, saved the company I founded, saved me and my personal life of having capacity. Often in an engineering organization, in an IT organization, or anywhere, you optimize a system and you aggressively attack it. These are the fundamentals of industrial engineering, of finance, of any kind of academic treatment. You shouldn't do that. So that's one thing. So you can read the book, learn about theory of constraints, and it's a really good book. But this is a thing that I live by. Well, what does that have to do with what you were promised with these flying cars? Well, let me get there. But before, why am I talking about it? So I give you fair warning, beware of experts. So beware of anything I'm saying. So what I've worked on, if there's any treatment to it, is I've worked on some of the biggest machines on the face of Earth. I've worked on supercomputing and imaging, high-performance computing. I worked at HP on imaging. I started 2 companies working on edge computing and IoT. Now I'm going to harp on that because I founded 2 companies and I wrote 3 books on the subject, but it's all hype. We'll go back. I'll just plant that seed. I worked on machine learning. There's a lot of talk about machine learning. Everyone wants that. Matter of fact, when I was seeking investment dollars in my companies. I remember a Series A investment firm asking me if we could sprinkle some AI and machine learning into our products. It had no place in our products, but it would secure us funding and interest and hype. You have to watch out for this stuff. I built machine learning, and I know where it should be used. And I'm going to talk about utility. In fact, I worked on computer architecture, obviously. I'm a computer architect by heart. But what I really do now is, well, I'm at Microsoft. Well, what do I do? What I have to do is look for disruption. And that's where I'm going to turn this whole conversation around. And we're not going to focus on hype. We're going to focus on what's disruptive. And disruption, I'm talking big disruption. I'm talking not planned disruption. I'm talking about things that will be successful for your business, or you personally, your company, or your career. And what do? Well, here, I make video games. And it's a hell of a lot of fun. Working on supercomputing, working on machine learning, computer architecture, that's where I build it. I worked on the actual consoles, the system, xCloud servers, and there's all kinds of really fancy, well-produced graphics about that. But all the problems that I've witnessed in high-performance computing, in imaging, in all these areas directly apply to video games. And that's what's fun. But I'm not here to talk about video games. That's my day job. What I really want to talk about is hype. This is really interesting. This is an article from New York Herald. It's dated May of 1922. And they asked this author, he's a novelist, W.L. George, to write about your vision. What's your vision? What's your expert vision of 2022? May 2022. That's coming up in 2 weeks. Well, let's see what he said. So I'm going to summarize it for you and give you the Cliff Note version. What did he get right? Some things they got right. Old institutions and buildings will be preserved in the future. That's kind of a nebulous statement. That's, he wanted some inspiration there. We're not going to toss everything away. Well, pretty much. I mean, we still have old buildings. Coal for heating will be displaced by other energy sources. That's true. But the reason he did that wasn't for environmental reasons. The reason he said that was because it's a complete hassle and it's dirty to shovel your coal in your home and put it into your boiler or your heating unit in your basement. They used to have these coal chutes. And it's messy and gross, and that was the motivation there. This came off, he wrote this shortly after World War I, where they introduced chemical weapons, unimaginable weapons. And he stressed that weaponry is going to get more violent and more damaging and a lot and unimaginable. And that's absolutely true. We have progressed very well in building unimaginable weapons. And the US will grow to about 240 million people. That's partially true, but he's right in the ballpark. I'll give him that one. And finally, he said that copper wires will be replaced by wireless communication, wireless power. If you ever saw a picture of New York City in 1922, or the first half of the 20th century, you'll see strands of spaghetti wires crossing the streets just everywhere. You couldn't look at the sky without seeing wires, and a myriad of wires just everywhere. And it was just unsightly. It was also dangerous. And so he's right. But he also got a lot of things wrong. So meals will be replaced by pills. I've heard this over and over again. Even if I could replace a meal with a pill, I wouldn't want to do that. The reason he mentioned that is it's because it's a hassle to go to the market without refrigeration at the time. Go get a meal, prepare it, spend your time doing it. It was much more laborious in the first half of the 20th century to do that. He also suggested that housework will be replaced by disposable things. You'll just dispose of your furniture, your wallpaper, even your flooring. That didn't happen. That kind of happens if you're going to do a remodel or a deconstruction, but I'm not doing that every 3 months replacing my flooring. My wife would kill me. Cities will exist under glass bubbles. I was wondering the origin of this. I've seen these pictures of these cities, you're under a glass bubble. And yeah, if you want to control the weather, if you didn't have a good way to forecast your weather, and they did not have the ability to do that in 1922, the US will be better integrated and significantly less enterprising. I take complete contest with this. I do not believe we're completely integrated or well integrated, and I completely disagree that we're less enterprising. And he said that we'll nationalize infrastructure. Well, that didn't happen either, and I don't believe that's going to happen. Now, these 2 points of views, the pros and the cons, what he got right, what he got wrong, they are biased by what he viewed of the world at the time. He had this myopic view of, here are my issues, here are my challenges, this is all I know, and that's fair to him, that's all I have to go on. But that generates hype. And what hype is you're basically you're not looking at the present. You're only looking at the present. You're not looking at the future where other technologies are going to come together. You can't build a future roadmap based on hype. And also, you can't explain what you want. So, what did Henry Ford say? If you ask the customer what they want, they'll say a faster horse. Well, that's one of the reasons that you can't gravitate to hype and ask people what they want, because they're going to have this view of what they're using now. And finally, the most dangerous thing you can do in an organization, and I've witnessed this, and I'm going to give you some examples, are the shiny toy problems. This is where hype can cause catastrophic business and organizational failures that you'll be paying for eons. Let's talk about that. So where do you get this advice? Well, anyone know what these things are? A couple people. This is a hype cycle. And there's lots of ways to capture this. This is one analyst. They've been doing this for 30 years. And they have this hype cycle of emerging technologies. And it's called a hype cycle for a reason. It's hype. And things in this genre here start with an innovation trigger. There's some technology, some university report or white paper or something presented at a conference that garners attention, that garners publicity. And there's an early proof of concept, and things take off. There's a lot of hype. This is where the hype is on the rise. And that leads to the next thing, which is, well, you reach this peak. Where's that hype? That Jetson flying car, that's on that peak. Your flying car is over on the left. Peak of inflated expectations are, well, I'd really like to commute with it, but I can't commute in a city because you can't fly this in a population. I'd only like to pay $50,000. I'd like to have more than 20 minutes of battery life, and I'd like it for it to be safe. That's where I challenge that car, any kind of flying car, and a lot of other technologies, that they're stuck at this peak. And then we had the disappointment, right? There's loss of interest. There's loss of capital investment. You can't get your Series A investment or your angel investment. Things are starting to fall through because you didn't deliver, because you didn't answer those questions about what people really want. And then some companies pull through. Some of them pull through because of longevity. They've just been at it a while. And some of them actually wade through all of the mud and actually address what people want. And finally, you level set. Technologies become utility. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, do these hype cycles work? Do I look at them? I look at these reports. But do I build an organization? Do I build a technology stream out of it? No, I don't. And let's take an example. Let's look at the iPhone. I suspect everyone in this room has a smartphone. I'll make that assumption. If you don't, you probably should get one by now. It's arguable that this is a really good disruptive technology. This is the Apple iPhone. The project started with a project called Project Purple in 2005. And it wasn't anything new. It was based on the Apple Newton. Has anyone here heard of an Apple Newton? It was like a couple of people, again, a couple of people. This is a very, very early tablet from the 90s. And Steve Jobs at the time, he pulled 1,000 people together, and he produced this product in 2 years, which is insane in product development. But he did. And the project, when it debuted, when Steve Jobs went to, I forgot what conference they call that, but the Apple conference where he introduced it, he said, what if I could give you a device where you could play iTunes anytime? What if I could give you a camera? What if our next project, and we are working on a project of a 2-megapixel camera, an Apple camera, everyone's applauding. And then he said, what if I could give you something where you could play games on it, have a mobile gaming platform too? We're going to work on that product. And then what he did was, none of that's revolutionary. There were cell phones before 2007. He said, what if I could give that all to you in one product? And then he debuted the phone. And from that, a whole industry kicked off. Matter of fact, let's talk about disruptions. So this is from Our World in Data. This is a good source of data. And what you see here on the left is the US household share of homes that have flush toilets. And I thought that was interesting. How fast did flush toilets become commonplace? Well, actually, flush toilets, one of the fundamental designs was by a gentleman actually called Crapper out of Scotland. You look up the Crapper toilet. That took off in the 1800s to early 1900s, and then it became mainstream, where you could actually have like a water reservoir, and it kind of works. And it had that it had a slope, a pretty good slope to adoption over 40 years. Then you look at the IT industry in 1980, 1990, when PCs became mainstream, and that had even a more aggressive slope. But there has been no more aggressive slope than the adoption of mobile and smartphones that have ever existed. Now, smartphones have reached a point of saturation because usually they're tied to a human being, and actually the population of the world is slowing down. But that is disruptive. To go within, 10 years to 6 billion people, that's pretty good. So analysts should have picked up on that. Well, let's find out if they did. So the way that these charts work is you go back 10 years, and an emerging or disruptive technology should be there. Well, there is no emerging or disruptive technology for mobile devices or smartphones in 2002, according to this analyst report. There's some that says, voice over IP. Well, you kind of need that. And there's also Bluetooth. There's little components here, but nothing to address mobile. 2005, still. Steve Jobs formed the team. Steve Jobs saw something in 2005. He saw all these technologies come together, and he saw this grand vision of iTunes and being able to download apps and this huge, huge industry of mobile software development that he would control. Well, he saw that. They didn't see it. 2007, still didn't see it. iPhone gets released. 2008, they still didn't see it. A year after, millions and millions are being sold. People are waiting in front of the Apple store for these products. They still didn't see it. Later that year, they created a mobile application hype cycle for its very own segment. Now, in 2022, you actually see some emerging technologies around mobile, but they're not really emerging anymore. So I contend that they essentially missed it there. So now where can this go bad for your business? Oh, this is the best part. So how can a shiny object, these hypes, really harm you? And it's not just adopting technology, it's trusting your experts. So in 1993, there's a guy named Donald Knuth. He's out in Stanford. If you don't know who he is, he wrote this. Who's in software? Anyone was in software? Anyone with hands? Okay, a few people reluctantly saying they're in software. Okay, cool. He wrote these books. If you haven't seen them, these are the foundation of the algorithms and the proofs of software. This is how it works. Loops, sorting, just the basic junk of software. And he wrote those in the 70s or something. He had 40 years working on this, and then somewhere in the 80s, he wrote a book called Literate Programming. And literate programming was a great concept. It was being able to document your code. If anyone has written software, you know it's really important to document your code. But he forced it. He wrote a scheme, a process where you write your documents with the code, all in one. Right now, it's like anyone who's writing software, you need to document your code. You're going to put some inline statements in there and actually write a document. Break out Microsoft Word and write a document. This is not that paradigm. I'm not going to explain what this is. I'm going to explain what it did. So Donald Knuth, seasoned veteran of computer science. He is an expert. He is a technologist. He advocated it. It's also a very new concept back in the 80s and 90s. Being able to force documentation, force your developers to write documentation. It solved a problem. People weren't documenting their code. If someone left and I had to go take over someone else's design, I'm lost. I have to go read all that code. And it keeps our engineers up to date with the latest technology. I love that one. All of these are wrong. First off, academics aren't always right, and your senior technologists are often wrong, and they can be very, very, very wrong. I'm a senior technologist. I could be wrong. You don't trust them. It's new, so it's better. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's a shiny object. It solves a problem. Did you? So, this didn't. This forced a legion of developers to change their coding that they've been doing for years and adopt this new coding standard where they're embedding documentation in code and rewriting everything. And it worked for one product release. But then we discovered something. You can't move your code around. You can't change your code without changing the entire tool set, and no one else in the industry adopted this. So your code is worthless. So I spent 2 years with a team of people taking all this code that was written in this, millions of lines of code. It was called C-Web. This was before the web existed. This was called the web programming. And bringing it back to something that would actually work, C code. If anyone knows C code. And technologies always change. Like I was just saying, will this work in the future? And the answer was no. So we took 2 years, a legion of engineers, and we had to extract all this crap that was done because a senior technologist adopted a shiny object that was glorified by a professor at Stanford. Albeit he wrote the book on coding. This didn't do our customers any good. Imagine if those legion of engineers were actually developing user-facing features, new products, and not paying technical debt. I've spent a career managing technical debt. It is the worst thing for a company in IT or in engineering. And here's a little infographic. IEEE, if anyone's familiar with that, they're a very respectable professional institution. They track how code is used and what programming paradigms are prevalent right now. I actually cleaned this up. There's about 100 different languages. A lot of them are dead, but some of them just don't go away. In 2004, I was told, you know, you're running this team, we got to get all your code that you're developing out of C. C is dead. Procedural programming is dead. New engineers are not going to adopt it. Well, what we find out is that that was not true. That senior technologist was wrong. And right now, C is the second highest demand job for computer science graduates and for people that I'm actually hiring for the work that I do. It doesn't go away. This is where you get into shiny toys and fad farms. So I caution you when you're making an organizational mandate, or when a senior technologist has a shiny object, some new technology that you want to adopt, you have to take that with a grain of salt. You have to bring other people in there to balance that out, because often they are wrong. 5G is my poster child. I actually started with this slide. 5G is hyped more than any other technology, and it is littered with issues. 5G started with issues with their cell towers actually falling over in the wind. They've remedied that problem. But there's a lot of other problems. It is glorified hype at this point. Now, about that flying car. So, we should talk about what is real disruption. And there's 4 categories that I fit things in. When I have to look at a product, when I have to look at a design in my previous organizations, my companies, or what I do now, I see a lot of hype, I see a lot of technologies, but I have to answer 4 fundamental questions. One, these are obvious. Does it serve an underlying human or business need? And the Jeet who just talked said, people don't want to be lazy. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. People really enjoy sitting on the couch. They absolutely do. That is a human need. Food, other things that are basic are human needs. There's also business needs. If you can't articulate a technology as why it serves a human or business need, you have a problem at the start. Is it utility? Now, you have a lot of technologies and a lot of things that move from an emerging technology to utility. That's a good thing. It means it's mainstream, but it's not disruptive. Utilities are not disruptive. That is not where you're going to have this precipitous growth. And those are the products and the challenges that I look at. I want to look at those steep inclines of disruptive technologies. Utilities aren't that. I'll show you an example of a utility. Is the timing right? Here's another bit of information. I was at HP for many, many years, 21 years. And at the time, the organization had a division there called the Disk Memory Division. It was here in Boise. And they, in the mid to late 90s, they created a hard disk drive. Nothing new. But the hard disk drive was the size of your thumbnail. At the time, it was unheard of. There wasn't a product that wanted it. It was disruptive. It could have been disruptive. It was an emerging technology. It was pioneered by HP here in Boise, but the product was not timed right. If you had that technology, say, 5 years later, the iPod was released. That would have been a perfect design. That would have been disruptive. That would have been unprecedented. It would have reduced the size of that iPod, that very initial weird iPod with a little scrolly thing, to the size of something like this. And finally, is it beyond speeds and feeds? This is something that is often kind of misconstrued. Disruptive technologies are not increasing your resolution in your video game system. It's not increasing the speeds of your printer coming out of HP. It's not 5G. All of those are speeds and feeds. While those are interesting, they're predictable. I want to talk about disruptive technology. So, how does this work? Utility, fad. Artificial intelligence was on one of these hype cycles for a long time. And here's a timeline. And there's two ways a technology can go. Either it falls into the fad bucket, you don't want to be there, or goes into the utility bucket. If it's in the utility bucket, it means if you haven't adopted it in your organization, you probably should. You should be thinking about it. If it's in the fad bucket, you want to avoid this. Artificial intelligence, there's a lot of hype. As a matter of fact, the hype started, I don't know if you can read this, in 1956 at Dartmouth. This was the birth of AI. This was the Dartmouth Conference. This is where the grand visionaries of AI came together, like Minsky. And here's Minsky. He developed this thing called a perceptron. A perceptron is basically an artificial neuron. It's this little entity, it just sits there, and it thinks, but it's just one little cell. Well, that's cool. He had all these mathematical models. I won't bore you with all that. And then we entered the 70s and the 80s. This is actually called the dark ages of AI, believe it or not. It was actually, the US government said that AI will never work somewhere in the mid-70s. In the 80s, Digital and a few other companies created a thing called expert systems. And this was AI. You basically program a system with an expert, find an expert, of a machining tool, a CNC machine. And you had to program a machine to control that. Well, you talk to the expert, and you basically program everything that he knows. And there was a language that came out of it called Lisp. This was arduous, and it never was adopted. It was marginally adopted, but it generated a lot of hype. And a lot of universities had programs of artificial intelligence in Lisp. Well, no one uses that anymore. Sad to say. And it kept coming around. Then in the 90s, some more researchers came up with the idea of artificial neural networks. Neural networks is the heart of machine learning. It's what makes this work. But it couldn't work because it was missing a component. It wasn't timed right. And the timing was that you couldn't run it in human time. It would take a year to run an algorithm with these machines. But then, in the 2000s, late 90s, GPUs, the stuff that you play video games with, someone had the creative idea that, wow, these things would be phenomenally well suited for that artificial neural network. Someone else got wind of that and created a demo called AlexNet, and that's when that little bubble, that proof of concept, that all those write-ups entered that hype cycle and went nuclear. Well, now, with these technologies, and finally with a software foundation called TensorFlow and PyTorch, to make it easy to program this, we are now in the utility area of machine learning. It's not really hype, it's not disruptive. If you're not using it, you probably really should think about it. It's being used everywhere to solve real-world problems, and not just the problems that you'd be thinking about. Very nuanced problems. Now, what are the non-disruptors? As I'm getting close to my time here. Well, like I said, it has to serve these functions. I'm not going to talk about the metaverse. I'm not going to talk about 5G. I kind of beat up on that for a while. I'm not going to talk about IoT. I have a business based on IoT and edge computing and books, but it is not a disruptor. I'm not going to be talking about blockchains, NFTs, or cryptos. That's all hype. Those are not disruptors, and some of them are utility. And I'm not going to talk about Web 3.0. And machine learning, I'm on the edge here, because there is a nuance to AI and machine learning that we haven't crafted yet. What I want to talk about is my vision, where I think the disruptors are in technology. Healthcare is the big one. It serves a human need. Everyone wants to be healthy. Everyone wants to live longer. Everyone wants to pay less for medical. A little hard to read, but mRNA and CRISPR is a game changer in having individualized treatments, immunotherapy, and ways to solve actual heartbreaking and destroying diseases on the face of Earth. I can think of nothing more disruptive. I can end my talk here, and that is the big one. Wearable health, organ scaffolding, and synthetic cells. Synthetic cells are the creation of cellular structures at a cellular level, essentially creating life. This is where the technology is. These are disruptors. mRNA and CRISPR is almost getting to the point of being utility. Environmental technology. This is a big deal. Idaho is, what, another 10th year or 15th year of a drought. The whole West is on a drought. Climate change is real, and it's affecting things as fundamental to human need as water consumption. In the last lecture, Jeet had a stack of things you need for happiness and all that. At the bottom was water. It goes air and then water. Carbon sequestration is absolutely crucial. Many organizations are already rethinking how they sequester carbon. As a matter of fact, in my company, all our data centers are completely carbon neutral. That's huge when you think about data centers. Zero carbon cement. Cement in the production of cement. This isn't really IT, this isn't really interesting, but this is where there's going to be disruptive change, and whoever does that is going to have a leading position in industry and in national policy. Transportation, I need a car. One thing I'd like for my electric car is better EV infrastructure. And that is being delivered, again, through institutional and national policies, but also need. There will be a business need to build more infrastructure to give us more electric charging and EV infrastructure across the nation and across the globe. And of course, driverless transport. They've been working on ADAS systems for 20 years. And this is where there still is a lot of work to go to utility. Now, my passion is, for the last 30 years, I've been fighting Moore's Law and Dennard scaling all that time. And everyone says, we're at the end of Moore's Law. You can't scale transistors down anymore. When you start shrinking them, things get hotter. These things burn up. Can't do it. Well, I'm not convinced. I actually see a path forward. And what I suspect and what I do know is within the next 10 years, we'll have further improvements in silicon design. Not necessarily with the number of fabs in the world, and the supply chains that I alluded to. But the technology is there using things called nanowires, things called die-to-die stacking. Instead of having a planar piece of silicon like this, I'm going to be able to stack them in 3 dimensions. We've been living in a 2-dimensional world on these things. This is going to change. And memory-based neural networks. I won't go into the details. If you want to talk to me about that, I have some grand visions on memory-based neural networks. Immersive computing is really interesting. This is where I believe that things like spatial computing and elements of 5G and Wi-Fi will actually come into being. And this is around having a device understand its proximity, not with vision, but with electromagnetic energy. Believe it or not, you can use millimeter wave and Wi-Fi to actually see things and see the world around you. There is some very fundamental research going on that is incredible. Being able to sense, see, and understand what's happening from who's in a room to where objects are to a human heartbeat can be done through electromagnetic sensing. And another one here is autostereoscopic light field arrays. Well, that's a big word. What does all that mean? Essentially, 3D screens without glasses. This is the grand vision. This is why I'm a little dubious about VR and metaverse and whatnot. What I really want to do is I want to be lazy. I really want to be lazy. I want to sit on my couch, and if I tilt my head left or right, and if I choose to get up, I'll get up. Right now, if I have a VR, I have to put on a headset and I have to actually be physical. A lot of people just want to sit on their couch. Being able to do this, and you can, there's a device right here that you can buy. It projects a 3D image you can hold in your hand, you can move it around. It looks like a little glass cube. And this is going to be an industry that will grow. Energy is another big one. This goes into transportation. I am a big proponent of solid state and metal-based batteries. Moving away from lithium ion, some of the issues with the weight, some issues with the safety of lithium ion. I believe that solid state is an area that will be prevalent. Small scale nuclear. I think this is part of our energy plan. There's a lot of discussions about how you handle nuclear material, fissionable material. Small scale nuclear, I believe, should be part of a green energy plan, and I am a proponent of that. And finally, gallium nitride power supplies. Everything here, including my laptop has this, you probably have laptops, you have these little bricks, right? You have little wall warts, you plug your phone in. Those are all based on silicon, and they're not efficient. I believe that all the devices that you plug into the wall should be powered by a gallium nitride power supply. It'll have 30% more power efficiency and 33% less area. Your wall wart could actually be the cable. Food and agriculture, we have to find a way to get around the supply chain issues, especially around fertilizer, of all things. And there's a lot of fundamental work going on with self-fertilizing crops. A crop that could actually be harvested, go barren, and the soil will reclaim the nutrients. And finally, my favorite, and what I'm most bullish on, is quantum computing. This is, in the 0 time I have left, this is the big one. This is the fundamental disruptor. Imagine you buy anything online. If you've been on, I'm assuming you've all been on Amazon or bought something online. You have a little RSA security thing. The whole e-commerce, the fundamental way the world works is by securing and encrypting data. That could be broken now with a quantum computer, with some of the work going on with topological qubits and getting around the issues with errors that are by nature at a quantum level, and the demonstration of quantum supremacy by Google. This gives me confidence that I see the light at the end of the tunnel, that we can get to this grand vision of having quantum be able to do away with all encryption. Now imagine that. So now everything that you do online is now not safe. But then again, you can use a quantum computer to do quantum encryption. Whoever commands that is a disruptor. And this is the one area I'm most bullish on, because I do see the light at the end of the tunnel. These are the areas that interest me. I don't know if I'm an expert, I don't really know or care, but you should take it with a grain of salt. So that is my talk. This is me. That's where I can be reached. If you're interested in books, especially books that might put you to sleep, there's a good one right there. That's it. Thank you so much.
Perry, thank you so much for closing us out today. What a whirlwind of information. I promised you guys like this, right? You're going to go home and Google stuff just like I am. But all jokes aside, I hope you all had a good time today. The day is not quite over. You're going to get rid of me, which is probably the biggest win so far of your day. One last time, I would like to thank the sponsors, especially point out Fisher's Technology as our platinum sponsor and the title sponsor. Again, today's event would not be possible without them. Make sure that you do sign up for the prizes. They're going to be given away between 4:30 and 5. There are more prizes than we just showed on the screen earlier, and you still have time to do that. So even if you still have to download the app and then register for the prizes, go ahead and do that. Be sure to keep an eye out for a couple of community events coming up that are sort of in synergy with what you saw today. On April 26th, we have the IDO Technology Council's Capital Connect Conference. On May 3rd, we have the Boise DevOps Day. And shameless plug here, our biggest, Trailhead's biggest event of the year, which is Idaho's biggest entrepreneurial event, Boise Entrepreneur Week, will be in October. Make sure that you follow us, check it out, sign up for any of those. If you don't have the conference app, please do it, sign up. And last but not least, thank you, Perry, for closing us out.
Thank you.
All right, that's all I had. Good riddance. It was a pleasure being your MC today.